Vamos a empezar este acto en el cual tenemos la suerte de contar con una primera figura en nuestro campo. Creo que es una suerte para la facultad y para todos vosotros que podéis escuchar a alguien que ha hecho aportaciones discutibles a un específico campo de conocimiento. Va a hacer la presentación el doctor Schalock, que Emiliano es quien me conoce mejor. Inmediatamente pasamos a dar inicio a la charla. Así que paso la palabra para que nos presente la trayectoria de profesor.
Gracias, Emilio. Buenas tardes a todos. En primer lugar, quiero excusar la ausencia de este acto del director del instituto, Miguel Ángel Verdugo. Esta mañana le han dado el premio Reina de Sofía y obviamente pues, no podía estar en este acto. Desde aquí, pues, la enhorabuena para él y para todo el instituto, de que formamos parte de todos, ¿no? en el fondo. Quiero agradecer a Robert que esté en nuestra facultad y en nuestra universidad, iluminándonos con toda su sabiduría, y quiero presentaros un poco quién es Robert, qué es lo que ha hecho y que os hagáis una idea de quién tenéis delante y con quién vais a disfrutar la próxima hora y pico. El doctor Robert Schalock es doctor honoris causa por nuestra universidad, por la Universidad de Salamanca, y es considerado uno de los expertos mundiales en el ámbito de la discapacidad y es una referencia obligada para todos los investigadores, docentes, profesionales e incluso para las propias personas con discapacidad. Es profesor emérito de la Universidad de Nebraska y ha ostentado cargos de responsabilidad en muy diferentes organizaciones profesionales y científicas, pues, destacando su labor, por ejemplo, como presidente en lo que antes se denominaba como Asociación Americana para el Retraso Mental. Desde esta asociación, una de sus principales contribuciones ha sido el desarrollo del nuevo paradigma de la discapacidad intelectual, un paradigma que ha sido clave por sus implicaciones conceptuales y sobre todo por su aplicación práctica en el campo profesional de la discapacidad. Es miembro activo de comités y comisiones internacionales, probablemente de las más relevantes en el campo de la discapacidad intelectual, y destaca su participación en la Asociación Internacional para el Estudio Científico de la Discapacidad Intelectual. Es reconocido por sus investigaciones en diferentes ámbitos relacionados con el campo de la psicología y la discapacidad, incluyendo la neuropsiquiatría, el desarrollo de programas, la evaluación de servicios, la elaboración de instrumentos de evaluación, el empleo y la calidad de vida. Nació en Washington el 6 de julio de 1940, realizó sus estudios de psicología en la Washington State University, obteniendo el grado de doctor en psicología general experimental en 1966. Realizó también estudios de posgrado en neuropsiquiatría, educación experimental, educación especial y empleo. Entre el 62 y el 67 desarrolló tareas de docencia e investigación en la Washington State University, en el Hospital de Washington y en el Mental Health Research Institute. Desde el 67 hasta el 2000 ocupó el cargo de director del Departamento de Psicología del Hastings College de Nebraska, pasando posteriormente a ser profesor emérito. Su actividad científica se recoge en más de 34 libros, 6 monografías y más de 130 artículos científicos. Su repercusión internacional queda reflejada en la traducción de sus publicaciones pues, a muchas lenguas, incluyendo japonés, chino, francés, italiano. Sus artículos aparecen en revistas internacionales de gran impacto y goza de numerosas distinciones y premios a su labor docente investigadora. Es miembro de consejos editoriales de revistas relevantes, tanto en nuestro país como de nivel internacional. En nuestro país participa, por ejemplo, con las revistas de Inglaterra, revistas españolas sobre discapacidad intelectual, y en el ámbito internacional pues, pertenece a consejos editoriales de revistas como American Journal of Mental Retardation, Applied Research in Mental Retardation, Evaluation and Program Planning of Mental Retardation. En calidad de vida, sus principales trabajos se centran en la definición del concepto de calidad de vida, sus componentes y el desarrollo de instrumentos de evaluación de sus componentes. Este modelo es esencial en la organización, la planificación de los servicios y la atención a personas con discapacidad en todo el mundo, y en España ha servido como referencia para muchas asociaciones y organizaciones, y destaca un poco cómo su modelo ha sido asumido por asociaciones como CEAPS, Confederación Española de Asociaciones en Favor de las Personas con Discapacidades Intelectuales. Cabe destacar su presencia en distintos países, impartiendo conferencias en los principales congresos, seminarios y reuniones científicas. Y bueno, desde hace más de 20 años se ha vinculado con nuestra universidad. Desde el principio, el Instituto Universitario de Integración en la Comunidad ha contado con su presencia, por ejemplo, en las jornadas científicas de investigación sobre discapacidad. Y también ha impartido cursos, y de hecho esta mañana se ha pasado dando 5 horas de clase en los principales programas de máster del instituto, el máster de integración de personas con discapacidad, el máster de investigación sobre discapacidad. Ha realizado investigaciones y publicaciones en colaboración con muchos miembros del INICO, del Instituto Universitario de Integración en la Comunidad, y ha facilitado además la conexión de estos con diferentes instituciones internacionales y otros grupos de investigación. Por lo tanto, es una persona clave en toda la labor que hemos desarrollado dentro del INICO creo que queda claro quién es Robert y ahora solo nos falta disfrutar de su charla. Welcome, Robert. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and knowledge with us.
You can hear me okay? Well, buenas tardes. It's great to be here in Salamanca. When we walked in this afternoon, we had a press conference. Very well. Is it on? Is it on? No. How about that? As I was saying, when we walked in this afternoon, we had a press conference. And the first question was, what does it feel like to be in Salamanca? And I said, it feels like coming home. Because this is the 19th year that Sue, my wife, and I have come almost on a year to be with you students and your predecessors, to meet and truly become very close to so many of your professors and our colleagues. And it's always wonderful to see you. But also to be re-energized. Because one of the things that Salamanca does to me and to my wife Susan is it gives us new life. Because of the beauty of their university, the friendliness of people who are here, and the intellectual stimulation that I always find here. I had the honor and the privilege last night and again this morning to interact with graduate students in the master's class. And it was indeed a wonderful opportunity to share ideas, to develop new concepts, and to really energize one another. And so for all those reasons, it's truly wonderful to be here. You're very lucky, not just to be a student in a wonderful university, but to live in an era that indeed offers unbelievable opportunities. Challenges, yes, but opportunities, definitely. So one of the things that I want you to think a bit about tonight is, what is your responsibility as a professional? Because all of you, at one point in time, soon, will become a professional. Now, collectively, we're very lucky. Because we have a translator, Javier, with whom I worked for a number of years. And I guarantee you, is an extremely competent, superb translator. So if you can understand what I say, it's not my fault. I want to start with a statement by a poet, for achievement. And she said, over the years, I have learned that you will not remember what I say. You will forget what I do. But you will never forget how you feel. So one of the things that I hope happens over the next hour is that you will feel good about yourself. You'll feel good about your future. And indeed, you will feel good about the things that you need to do to be a contributing professional in whatever discipline you're in. Now, what we're going to talk about tonight is reflected in this slide. Francis Bacon taught us the importance of asking questions. So I'd like to begin our time together by asking you 5 questions. What is professional responsibility? That's question 1. Secondly, what high-stakes decisions will you make as a professional? The third thing I'd like to have you think about is the importance of not making thinking errors. Fourth, we're going to talk about 5 critical thinking skills that when you implement them are going to allow you to make better decisions and better recommendations regarding your profession. One of the newsmen asked me in the interview, he said, well, do I think people think critically? And I said, no. Because we've all been taught to do a lot of analysis, but we haven't been taught to do very much synthesis. We've learned an awful lot about individuals, but haven't learned a lot about systems. We've learned a lot about organizing, but haven't learned anything about alignment. And so those are the critical thinking skills that we will talk about in our review briefly. And finally, as a 5th question, think about your future. One of my favorite philosophers and poets is your Spanish philosopher and poet, Gazet, who has a wonderful statement where he says, human life is a constant preoccupation with the future. So, as you think about your future as a professional, let's move next to what are your professional responsibilities. And I would suggest there are 4 criteria that you want to keep in mind as you think about what is one's professional responsibility. First, you need to be well trained. And you're receiving that training. But that's only one criteria. You're not a professional just because you're well trained. Because there's a second important ingredient or criteria. And that is that you follow professional standards. Now, what are some of those professional standards? You see them listed there. There's 3 or 4 of these standards that are very, very important. For example, you should use current information. And that current information should be valid. Now, all of you are going to be in situations where you read case studies and files on you. And some of that information is old information. A very brief example. A lot of individuals are on anticonvulsant medication procedures. And they may be 50 years old. And they're still on medication because at age 15, they had a seizure. And so for 40 years of their lives, they've been on anticonvulsant medication based on a single seizure when they were 15. And so a professional standard is definitely to use current information as valid. Because consequently, you make unbelievable errors in judgment. Secondly, you need to respect professional and client relationships. And those relationships are changing. It used to be that professionals were God. You made the decisions for people. You told individuals what's good and bad about themselves. You diagnosed them. And consequently, they became very dependent on you as a professional. But life has changed. Because what's happening in the world of self-advocacy is that people with disabilities are viewing themselves differently. They're viewing themselves as more equal than unequal. They're viewing themselves as more empowered than powerless. And so professional relationships are much more of a co-equal. They're not a dependency-producing relationship. And good professional standards recognize the changing role of clients. Third, you need to ensure consent. Horrible things have happened to people over the years, clients, who were not asked, do you want this? We were at the university again last week, and we were talking about the alignment of the UN Convention on the Rights of Individuals with the Quality of Life concept. Now, one of the speakers from the mental health field showed a film that had a powerful, powerful message. And that message in the title was, "We survived the psychiatric experience." And then the speaker was a person from the World Health Organization. He met the previous day with a group of mental health providers. And he asked that group, if you had a mental health problem, would you admit yourself to one of your facilities? And not one member said they would. So the net result is that consent is changing. And that we have to think about not just doing things to people, but doing things with them. And consent to treatment, consent to supports, is one of the big things that self-advocates want to talk about. And when you talk to self-advocates about that, they frequently say, get out of my life. We're involved in a very interesting study in this regard. And the study is a very simple one. We ask individuals to tell us what are the three most important things that have happened to them the last year in their life. The three most important things. These are clients in services very much in this area. So they list what are the three most important things that happen to them. And then we go into their individual support plan and see whether or not there's anything in that support plan that relates to what they want. Now, what's your hypothesis? What would you predict? Is there any relationship between what a person says is the most important thing that's happened to me and what we're spending hundreds of thousands of euros on? I don't know the answer, but I have a hypothesis. There's no relationship. Because unless we ask the person, what are your personal goals, and focus on both what's important to the person and what's important for the person, we will never align what they want with what they get with the outcome. So the net result is professional standards are changing in reference to this whole area of consent and equity. Now, we also, as professionals, need to act in accord with a code of professional ethics. And you can see the three ethical principles there that really underlie most ethical principles. We need to treat all people equally. That is justice. And what that means is there's no litmus test. There's no test that says if you have a certain level of ability, you have more options than if you don't have that same level of ability. That's a litmus. And that's injustice. That's discrimination. One of the strongest movements afoot throughout the world today is called the capabilities movement. And what the capabilities movement is saying is that all people are capable of things, of doing things. And all people should have the opportunity to do those things. And you don't have to be a certain size or a certain IQ level or a certain level of sensory motor integration in order to have those opportunities. Because that is not a professional ethic. To do disjustice to people rather than doing justice. But there's a second professional ethic, and that is doing good. And indeed, we need to constantly strive that what we do has a benefit to the individual, not a detriment to the individual. And frankly, that's one of the ugly parts of the diagnosis of a term. And consequently, we need to think in the terminology and the language that we use. Do we truly use person-first language? Is an individual with a disability as opposed to an individual or a disabled individual? People first says a lot. People first language says an awful lot about beneficence. That is doing good. And finally, as a professional ethic, we have autonomy. And this is going to be one of the greatest challenges that you as a professional have. And that is to really live this ethical principle. Because if you believe in that ethical principle of autonomy, then indeed every person should have the right to control as much about their lives as they can. And that's a challenge. Because our inclination is usually to protect people. And that's good. We should to a degree. But there's also the dignity of risk. Every one of us in this audience has had the opportunity to make a mistake. Every one of us has had the opportunity to move up. We've had the dignity of risk. One of the most popular line of books in the United States today has to do with failure. And there's a whole psychology of failure. And the general message in this literature is that we learn from making mistakes. And the net result is, even though we don't want to, we must take risks with the individuals with whom we work. Sometimes it's not going to work well more times than it doesn't work well. And if you believe in this ethical principle, then we must also assume the dignity of risk. And then fourth, as a criterion for professional responsibility, we have critical thinking skills. And we'll talk about those here in a few minutes. So, as we move on then, this is a point that I want to make sure that you understand. Professional responsibility, whatever it is, and whatever it's based on, begins with respect for person. Unless we respect the individual, then we can never really be a productive and valuable. And as you see in this slide, there are certain characteristics that represent respect. And that is, we need to give attention to the individual. We need to show concern. We need to emphasize the humanness of the person. And we really need to engage in person-centered practices. And please, whatever you do, don't fall into a trap. And the trap is, you say we're doing person-centered planning, but the person's not. So how can you possibly do person-centered planning without the person? So if you're going to provide services to individuals, follow the dictates of the self-advocates who have this statement. Don't talk about me without me. Don't talk about me without me. Because if you do, you're not respecting that person. You're treating that person as a case. And you want to treat the person as a person. But respect also involves those things that you see listed here. Respecting personal autonomy, and on down, and you can read those. Are you okay? Can you see those already? Say Javier over there. The important point of starting with respect for the person is that you recognize that people are whole individuals. It's so easy for those of you who are in OT and IT and psychology. It's so easy to focus only on your discipline and to look only at the mental health of the individual, or only on the physical health of the individual, and forgetting that the individual is an individual. And the reason why quality of life, I think, is such an important concept is that it recognizes that wholeness. It recognizes the importance of personal development, of self-determination, of interpersonal relations, of social inclusion, of rights, and then emotional, physical, and material well-being. So if we really do what we should be doing in respecting the individual, we really look at the whole person and recognize that if this is an individual who is lying in bed, and that's the only thing that that person does day in and day out, and we think only about that person in bed and taking care of the bed sores, etc., we're missing something. We're missing the opportunity to allow that person to be more self-determined in terms of watching what they want to on television, or using an iPad to play whatever game they want to play, or choosing what balloons are above their bed, or choosing what they eat. Think about put a life of 12 hours, 24 hours in bed and do not. And the only focus of that care is to make sure the individual doesn't get well fast. If we truly respect the individual, we not only look at the physical needs, which are very significant, there's no question about that, but we also remember the other domains of our life. And if we respect that individual as a professional, then we absolutely insist that we not just talk the talk of quality of life, but we walk the walk. Now, you're all going to be making high-stakes decisions. And what you see in this particular overhead is the kinds of high-stakes decisions you're going to be making. And I won't bore you with all the details of this. This presentation is available if you want to go to it. But most of you are going to be involved in either diagnosing people, classifying people, or planning supports. Those are the three things that most professionals do. So the point that I want to make here is that in terms of any one of those functions, those clinical functions, there are tremendous high stakes for the person involved. The high stakes, if you diagnose a person, is the diagnosis that you give the person. Because once a person gets a diagnosis in most societies, it stays with them for a while. And so consequently, be sure that that diagnosis is correct. It's based on the best evidence possible. It's based on clear thinking and not fuzzy thinking. And it is based on, indeed, time with the individual. And that's a challenge. Because professionals are asked to make a diagnosis in a very short time. And so consequently, the high stakes involved in making the diagnosis is to make a valid diagnosis. Because if it's a valid diagnosis, people are eligible for services. If it's a valid diagnosis, people are eligible for protection. And that's good. But a bad diagnosis may lead to something that stays with that person forever. And they never outlive the trauma of being diagnosed incorrectly. So we talked about false positives and false negatives. And they occur. A false positive is one in which a person who is not intellectually disabled, for example, is diagnosed as intellectually disabled. Because they may have bad language. A false negative says this person is not, but they really are. And therefore they lose the protections that they have. So in diagnosis, and those of you who will be involved in diagnosis, those are high stakes. But there are also high stakes involved in classification. We classify people in numbers of ways. And the point that I will make repeatedly tonight is that how you classify a person depends upon the purpose of the classification. If indeed the purpose of the classification is to allocate resources. Then the classification system should be one of the cost drivers of services and support. If the purpose of classification is to provide supports for people, then the basis of that classification should be a support assessment. So we want to make sure that when we classify, there's a reason for our classification. You can go through any case record, and you're going to find all kinds of diagnoses and all kinds of classifications. And the question that you constantly want to ask yourself is that a valid diagnosis and classification? Because there are tremendous high stakes involved. But there are also high stakes involved in support. And one of the challenges that all organizations have today, all service providers have today, is to provide a system of support to people that is truly individualized. And that not everyone gets the same thing. And that's a sophisticated thinking skill, is to realize that this individual needs these kinds of support. They don't need those kinds of support. Now, one of the things that's happening in many countries is that the funding is changing. And what I mean by that is that what a number of jurisdictions are doing is providing money, the money, to the client and family. And then what the client and family are doing is purchasing what supports they need. Now that's a very different approach to service delivery. But it's happening in many places because organizations are not responsive to the individualized support needs. So what we need to do is be a bit smarter in tailoring support programs. Because there are high stakes. If you need this and get that, you're not going to see change in members of the individual. So, you will be making high-stake decisions. And be sure that the decisions and the recommendations that you make are based on not just good critical thinking skills, but the decisions that you make avoid some very basic thinking errors. Now, what are some of the more common thinking errors that professionals make? One of them is called the affective error. And that error is when you make a clinical decision based on your feelings. I think this is best for you. That's an affective error. It may or may not be best for you. When she asks the individual, do you think it's best for me? Angering errors are very common in professional practice. And there what you do is you make sure your judgment on your first impression. So an individual walks into your office and that individual looks funny. Therefore, the individual must have a mental health issue. Or the person walks into your office and they may not look very bright. Therefore, they are intellectually disabled. So you react on the basis of sort of first impressions, and those first impressions anchor what you do in terms of your work. The availability error is one that is also true, and that is whatever happened most recently is used to make a judgment. Now, if you work with challenging behavior people with challenging behavior, watch out for angry errors. Because you're going to get an who has maybe hit somebody, beat somebody up, destroyed a wall, and what you're going to do is you're going to say, that reflects that person's total behavior. Whereas indeed it might reflect just a single episode. So watch the availability. Watch blind obedience as the thinking error. Blind obedience basically means making a diagnosis or prescribing something based upon what the authority says or what indeed you're expected to say. Let me give you a very brief example. Years ago, I'm a psychologist, and I was doing a lot of clinical work with people with intellectual disabilities. And I was called in to a community in Nebraska. And there was a lady with intellectual disability in that community who had a child. And the community was absolutely convinced that because of her intellectual disability, her child should be taken away from her. The community decided. So the judge, in this particular case, brought me in and said, he had to make a decision. Do I take this child from this mother or do I not take this child? And he said, up front, he said, I want you to know, I think the community is right. Now, as a professional, I had to make a decision in reference to that person. Was the community and the judge right, and was I going to be obedient to them? Or was I going to be smart enough to develop a system of supports for that lady that would allow her to keep the child and get the support that she needed to be a mother? What would you have done? Would you have done blind obedience and said, yeah, the easiest thing for me to have done was simply to say, you're right. The child should be taken away. End of story. I leave. But I didn't do that. If I had respect for her, and if I had respect for the standards and ethics of the profession. And so what then I was willing to do, and I'm not bragging, but I'm saying you're going to be put in the same kind of situation. And when you're put in those kinds of situations, come down on the side of the individual. Don't come down on the side of blind obedience. That's a very bad thing. Some other ones very quickly. Confirmation bias is another one that's very common. And what you do is you basically confirm your lies. The framing effect is really very frequently done, where you mistake context for causation. And that's really true if you're working with indigenous people, people who may have language deficits, non-intellectual deficits, people who may have never had the opportunity to do whatever it is, and then are judged to be intellectually disabled because they've not done it. Those are all framing effects. But also watch diagnostic momentum as a thinking error. Watch diagnostic momentum. And what that does is it just piles diagnoses on diagnoses on diagnoses. A recent study in the United States, and I don't think this is really difficult, indicated that if you are a parent, you have a child with a disability, your child will be evaluated in the first 2 years of their life somewhere around 50 times. Now, how many people need 50 copies of the same diagnosis? What they need is one diagnosis and appropriate supports and services, right? But here's my point, my friends. It's so easy to sit behind a desk, administer a test, make a diagnosis, make recommendations, and then say, I've done my duty. That's only the beginning of it. Because it's really what we do to do supports for people, to help people after the diagnosis, that the true responsibility of the specialist comes into play. Okay, everybody together? Let's move on to the critical thinking skills. Now there's a lot of material on subsequent slides, but what I want to do is just give you the big picture, okay? The big picture of each of these critical thinking skills. When you analyze, what you do is you determine what are the component parts of something. And so consequently, if you analyze human functioning, it's important to realize that human functioning is involves intellectual functioning, adaptive behavior, health, and participation. And so you need to analyze all those aspects of a person, not just his or her IQ or his or her adaptive behavior level. If you are indeed looking at the impact of culture, you need to analyze how does culture really affect one's behavior. And you get this a lot if you get involved in diagnosing, for example, individuals from other cultures. And what you find is that a lot of those individuals may have different meanings for words. They may have limited receptive language in terms of the language that you're using. And this is really a critical thing for professionals in Los Angeles, as just one example. And I could go to Madrid and I probably would have a similar situation. Guess how many languages are spoken in the city of Los Angeles? On the streets of Los Angeles. There are 200 languages that are spoken on the streets of Los Angeles. On the streets of Madrid, how many would it be, do you think? About the same? A lot, whatever the answer is. So the point is, each of those languages represents a culture. And each of those cultures has different expectations about the people that abide by it. Therefore, if you get involved in diagnosing or classifying or providing support, you must analyze what role does culture play in that person's behavior. What is synthesis? What's alignment as our second critical skill? Alignment means that we bring things into a logical sequence. And where alignment thinking is probably most important is when we do support plans. Because what support plans need to do is to align, put into logical sequence, the personal goals of individuals and their support needs with the specific support strategies they receive with the anticipated outcomes. So that consequently you have a logical sequence between the inputs, the throughput, and the output. So alignment then is such an important thing to do and to think about as we work with individuals to provide individualized supports. Because if we individualize the treatment or supports we provide people, those supports and treatments are based upon their needs, or their goals, or their wishes. Synthesis is a wonderful critical thinking skill. There's an article, or a book rather, that is basically talking about the following statement. What the world needs is not more analysis, it needs more synthesis. And the point that the author makes, which I believe firmly, is that most people, most organizations, are data rich and information poor. You have all this information, but the question is, have you integrated it in a way that allows you to act on it? So there's never a question about your having information. You know, you can Google it, right? The question is, how do you synthesize? How do you integrate that information? And this becomes very important when you get into, again, providing supports for people. Because you have to integrate the individual with the organization, with the larger society. And when you do that, you begin to start talking about things like natural supports and community attitudes and organizations being bridges to the community. In other words, you synthesize the information in a way to make better sense out of it. And to realize that all of us have benefited from various kinds of supports. And what we need to do is to synthesize what supports people need. Do they need natural supports? Do they need technology? Do they need skills? Do they need environmental accommodations? Do they need their programs based upon their personal strengths? Or do they need professional services? Answering that question is using the critical skill called synthesis. But we also have systems thinking. And what systems thinking means is that we all live in a larger system. And we use terms like the microsystem to refer to the individual. And then we use the term mesosystem to refer to organizations, neighborhoods, families. But then we also have the macro system, the larger society. And for us to be effective as professionals, we have to work with all three systems. And we have to look within each of those three systems and ask, what are the things that we can build on? What are the personal strengths and interests and motivations of the individual at the microsystem? What can this organization do to provide appropriate supports for the individual? And then how collectively can we work in the larger society to change attitudes and to increase opportunities? Each one of those three systems provides tremendous opportunities for us. And unless we think about that is the three systems, we really are not fulfilling our professional responsibilities. Because one of our greatest professional responsibilities is to be advocates in the community. So do a little self-monitoring of your comments that you make about your clients. If you're a professional, are those comments positive? Are they upbeat? Or are they, I work with people who are retarded? If you're an organization, do you go to the community and say, this is what we have to offer? This is how we can do things for the community? Or do you go and say, give me money, please? Help these poor individuals who we're serving. What kind of an image in terms of the community are you giving, not just in terms of yourself as a professional, but the clients with whom you work and the organization for whom you work? And finally, we have transformational thinking. The reality here, my friends, is that human service organizations are changing. You're moving into an environment where organizations truly are different today than they were yesterday. And if they aren't, they will be different tomorrow than they are today. Transformation is sometimes a slow process. But for those of you who have worked in organizations for an extended period of time, 5 years or more, can you not say that those organizations have changed? And my bet is the answer is yes. Because we live in what is referred to as a transformation era. And that transformation era has certain characteristics. Number one, it's person-centered. Number two, it's horizontally structured. Number three, it's using information that is based upon what we call the multiple perspectives of an organization. The client, the organization's growth, the organization's financial analyses, and the internal processes. But another part of the transformation era is indeed the use of evidence-based practice. And consequently, we are asking people to think about what are evidence-based practices. And we talked about that this morning. We know what are good practices. We know what best practices are. We don't have to, and Morgan and I had this conversation yesterday, you don't have to do research on what are best practices. We know pretty much what those best practices are. What we don't know, and what we need to do, is to relate best practices to outcomes. Because when you then evaluate your best practices against desired outcomes, which in Spain are quality of life outcomes, and where you show that these practices produce these outcomes, then, and only then, can you talk about evidence-based practice. So the net result is, we need to think critically. We need to do analysis. We need to do alignment. We indeed need to do synthesis. We need to think about systems and the power of the microsystem, the mesosystem, the macrosystem. And finally, we need to recognize that indeed organizations are absolutely changing in very, very significant ways. Now, in the time that I have left, let's think about you. And let's think about you as a professional. And let me begin by sharing with you this statement by David Brooks, who's an editorial writer for the New York Times. And he says this: it's not what you know or the degree that you have, but it's how you put what you know to work. And the point there is, you can have all the degrees in the world, but if you don't apply what you know in useful ways, those are worthless degrees. The next statement comes from an article that I think is important. I'll just read the first sentence. That what's happening in the world today is a vast process of mental transplantation. And the point that Richard Sampson makes is that the computer is really taking over for our brain. So if we want information rather than learn it, we look it up. We actually have, and this is true, we actually have in the United States individuals who are graduating from high school who cannot write a cursive word. They can type it, but they cannot write a cursive word. In other words, according to Sampson, and I agree, we're having a mental and physical transplantation. This statement led Ruth Lexington to make the following statement in our second edition of Thinking Judges, which is just now published. And that is, the professional responsibility is not just about best practices, standards, ethics, and critical thinking skills, which I talked about this afternoon. It's also about relationship management. So let me conclude then by talking a little bit about your role in relationship management. And this is also part of being a professional. Because one of the things that any professional does, any professional is involved in a lot of relationships. You have relationships with colleagues, You have relationships with clients. You have relationships with families. You have relationships with employees, on it goes. So the question becomes, what kind of relationships are you going to foster as a professional? And again, to quote from another book on, I love the title, Average is Over. Isn't that nice? Average is over. And the premise of this book is, again, we live in an age of mechanical intelligence in which our skills need to be complementary to and extend beyond what you do. So let's think about you as a relationship manager. And let's think about what you're going to need as a relationship manager. Number one, you need to be three stylers. Don't forget intuition. And for whatever's sake, don't forget you have a brain. Because you're going to need to stand outside the box. You're going to need to stand outside the computer. And you're going to have to make decisions. And you're going to have to make recommendations. And so consequently, don't forget that the brain is not a bad mechanism. Secondly, you're going to need to be a synthesizer. For all the reasons that I mentioned before. And the best way to be a synthesizer is to be a good storyteller. People love stories. People learn from stories. People remember stories. They don't remember a 10-page report. But they will remember a good story. Every one of you will remember, I guarantee you, the story that I told about the woman with the child. You're going to remember that. You may remember nothing about all the other critical thinking skills. You will remember that story. And why is that? Because stories are powerful. Stories allow you to synthesize a lot of information. Because you see, what I could have talked about is human rights and the right that that lady had. I could talk about support systems. I could talk about community attitudes. But I didn't. I synthesized all of that into a very brief story. So be good synthesizers. You'll be very effective communicators, I think, if you do. But never forget that you need to be a humanizer. You need to relate to people and not machines. I get a little concerned when I see two young people, a woman and a man, or a man and a man, two young people, sitting next to one another, texting. And never talking to one another. We had lunch at the hotel today, Sue and I, and there was a table of 5 men next to us. The first thing they did when they came in was they sat down and they took their phones out. And I just sort of tabulated what happened. 80% of their time was spent on phones, not talking to one another. Now, why on earth would you go to lunch with a group of colleagues and spend all the time on the phone talking to somebody else? What's the message? It's pretty clear, isn't it? They're what I call phoneaholics. As opposed to you need to be conceptual engineers in the worst way. You need to come up with creative methods to solve complex problems. And indeed, the world is full of conference hall. What we need to be is what a lot of people are calling on-demand creativity and inventiveness. On-demand creativity and inventiveness. You need to have answers quickly. You need to be able to say, let's try this, let's do that. Because you do not have the luxury of it. You also need to be motivators. In this machine-dominated world in which we live, what motivates your behavior? Is it the machine? Or is it other people? And when you work with people, do you motivate them in terms of what you say to them, or do you text them? There's a big difference in meaning. You need to be what David Brooks calls greeters. One of the real things we're losing, and many people have written about it, one of the many things we're losing in this technological era that I talked about before is social interaction. Increasingly, people interact with their machines as opposed to people. And the net result of that is you become less influential as a person. And if that person happens to be you as a professional, you become less influential as a result. And finally, you need to be weavers, according to David Brooks. That is, you need to develop a very rich inner life. Realizing that in the end, what's really important is what we say to ourselves about ourselves. Not what we put on our Facebook. And finally, what are the takeaways? What is it that you're going to walk out that door with? Your minutes. And what I've done here is simply summarize the key points. You're going to make high-stakes decisions as a professional. Your professional responsibility does indeed start with respect to the person. And then it goes into the training you're receiving, the standards that you're going to meet as a professional, and the ethics that you are going to live as a professional. But you also are going to increasingly need critical thinking. Those skills that allow you to be more effective in what you do and more efficient in the way you do it. And finally, remember that it's not really what you know or the degrees that you have, but it's how you take what you know and the experience and wisdom that you have to indeed make a difference in your client's life. And that's really the bottom line of professionalism. It's not what we are, but what we do. It's not what we think, it's who we support. It's not what we worry about, it's what we make happen. It's not the problems that we experience, it's the opportunities that we take advantage of. So let's go back to my opening comment. You're not going to remember much about what I say. You're not going to remember much about what we did here tonight. But I do hope that you remember how you feel. And truly, I hope you feel good about yourselves as young professionals. You feel good about the view you have of your future as a contributing professional and member of society. I also hope you feel very optimistic about your future and the role that you're playing in your respective systems. So with that, muchas gracias. It's been great being with you, and I wish each and every one of you the very best. Muchas gracias.
Creo que puede ser en castellano sin ningún problema. Si ese es el problema, no hay problema. Yo estaba teniendo y a ver si te toca traducir a mí, pero no va a traducir. Ánimo.
I think the reality is weird.